If the West imposes sanctions, the entire world should listen and will listen, because the West owns. The extent of sanctions misused as a weapon to feed the luxury and safeguard the comfort of the rich, spoiled brat called West is unexplainable. What on earth can differentiate US stationing its missiles or even building a US army base in a country next to Russia from Russia stationing its missiles in Cuba, which is next to US? Rest of the world is divided into two parts. One is NATO, which is led and controlled by United States. Other one is, but the foundation of all these wars and at the center of this World War III, this is how SWIFT system was misused to impose sanctions effectively. Now what is SWIFT system? Who comes on top for human rights violation? Is it Assad before 2011 or the West after 2011? You all must have heard the word sanctions, especially after Russia invaded Ukraine. This word has been very popular in global politics. What is or what are sanctions? I would say the closest word for sanctions is boycott or restriction. There are different types of sanctions like trade sanctions, targeted sanctions, financial sanctions. Sanctions in literal sense is just free format. It can be on anything. In reality, anybody can impose sanctions on any country, but it's just that nobody would follow or listen. For example, India can impose sanctions on Pakistan for its terrorist activities, but nobody would listen. China will still continue its arms trade, and what would India do? US would still send its 4th generation fighter jets to Pakistan, and what would India do? But on the other hand, United States, United Nations, Europe, collectively the West, all three different organizations but ultimately led by US. If the West imposes sanctions, the entire world should listen and will listen, because the West owns SWIFT payment system. When the West imposes sanctions on any country and freezes that particular country from using SWIFT system, any other country which doesn't dance to the tunes of West will also face similar situation. So no country would dare to deal with country sanctioned by the West. Let's look into how SWIFT system used as a weapon a little later. Before that, let's discuss a little more about sanctions, which was introduced after World War II. Sanctions was introduced to isolate any country that posed a threat to world's peace. But today, sanctions itself is a threat for the world's peace. The extent of sanctions misused as a weapon to feed the luxury and safeguard the comfort of the rich, spoiled brat called West is unexplainable. West took no time to misuse sanctions and SWIFT system for its own benefit, for its own comfort. Any leader who posed a threat to West's control over African continent and its control over oil in Arabic region or US dollar as an international currency were assassinated. Example, Patrice Lumumba of Democratic Republic of Congo. If assassination was not easy, then there would be sanctions imposed. For example, Cuba. Sanctions were imposed on Cuba because Russian missiles were stationed in Cuba. Tell me people, what on earth can differentiate US stationing its missiles or even building a US army base in a country next to Russia from Russia stationing its missiles in Cuba, which is next to US? Anyways, if sanctions too didn't serve the purpose, the West purpose, then all of a sudden people from that particular country were suffering and West would invade and get freedom to that people. Or that country had weapons of mass destruction. Example, Iraq, Syria. If West couldn't create a fake story that would convince the world to put sanctions, West would go to an extent and find some comedian and convince the comedian to attack a country which is equally strong compared to US and make the people of that country, for example Ukraine, a scapegoat. So that the target country, for example Russia, attacks, kills and hurts the scapegoat. Then the world would be convinced to impose the biggest ever sanctions in the history. I lived in Poland, Europe for 7 years, and Polish people are really amazing people, peace loving. They have fought their heart and soul to get the land that belongs to them, the land that they have today. They didn't get anything for free, and they didn't get anything at the cost of someone else's peace. There are many countries, part of Europe like Poland, who do not play any role in the world politics. But unfortunately, these countries are part of the union called European Union. A union where countries like France, Germany, Britain, Belgium, Portugal, Italy in 1884 divided Africa like a piece of cake in Berlin Conference. And even today, these European countries are the main reason for the instability in Africa. Even today, they are controlling Africa by supplying weapons to rebel groups, inflicting conflicts to keep the countries unstable, and killing leaders who speak against the West. There are always two sides of any war. One side are criminals, also called as aggressors, and the other side are victims. When it's Arabic nations, it's always debatable who is aggressor and who is the victim, or who started and where it started, whether right or wrong, truth or lies. Both the arguing sides have some points at least to keep the argument going. But when it is Africa, I don't think there is a single person in this entire world who can put Africa on the aggressor's side with valid points. Africa, which can feed the entire world, or which is feeding the world in many ways, remains not just below poverty line but layers and layers below poverty line. Look at this video of an African kid. And look at this video of a leader of Burkina Faso.
14 African countries still use French colonial currency. 50% of these countries' central bank reserves sit in the French treasury. France applies negative interest to this money, so we pay France to use our own money. Through this system, France transfers $500 billion worth of resources from Africa every year. Does anyone write about this? No. But when France gives Africa 10 billion euros in aid, it makes headlines.
The solution is not to take Africans and move them to Europe. The solution is to free Africa from certain Europeans who exploit it and allow these people to live off what they have. This is called the CFA franc, a colonial currency that France prints for 14 African nations, and by virtue of which it exploits the resources of this nation. This is a child working in a gold mine in Burkina Faso. Burkina Faso is one of the poorest nations in the world. For Burkina Faso, which has gold, France prints colonial currency. In return, it demands that 50% of everything Burkina Faso exports ends up in the coffers of the French treasury. The gold that this child crawls into a tunnel to extract mostly ends up in the coffers of the French state.
Africa is indirectly controlled by West, mainly by 3 or European countries, and the West, mainly US, is controlling Arabic nations by force. Rest of the world is divided into two parts. One is NATO, which is led and controlled by United States. Other one is Russia, China and India, since recently collectively known as BRICS. Today the world is at war, just one step away from World War III. Everyone should be thinking this situation probably started with multiple issues, multiple places, in multiple countries, like Israel-Gaza war, or Israel-Iran war, Russia-Ukraine war, India-Pakistan war, or China-Taiwan war, which is around the corner. But the foundation of all these wars, and at the center of this World War III, is survival of dollar, United States dollar as an international currency, with each of these wars planned at least couple of decades before. At least 20 top economists of the world predicted Russia-Ukraine war 30 years before if NATO expanded more towards east, that is towards Russia, and the red line was Ukraine's inclusion to NATO. But why would US still want to include Ukraine to NATO? When the West imposes sanctions on any country, that country is freezed in SWIFT payment system so that the sanctioned country cannot send or receive money from any other country. And any other country which would like to challenge the sanctions imposed would have to deal with the similar situation. So no other country would dare to challenge West till date. This is how SWIFT system was misused to impose sanctions effectively. Now, what is SWIFT system? SWIFT is an abbreviated word which stands for Society of Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication. SWIFT is a payment network, a messaging platform to send and receive international money. Any payment between banks from two different countries can only be made via SWIFT. How does SWIFT system works? Let's not get into too much detail of how SWIFT system technically works. We don't need that much technical details. But for a layman to understand how SWIFT payment system works, first I would like to explain how India's UPI works, Unified Payments Interface. Most of the Indians know today how to pay or receive money using their mobile. There is a payer. In this example, it is Manjanna. There is a mobile application installed by the payer like PhonePe, GPay, Paytm or any other application. And then there is a receiver. In this example, it is Rajanna. There is a mobile application again installed by Rajanna. Both payer and receiver payments are linked with a mobile number, and that mobile number is linked to a bank account. So the payer just has to select the contact in his mobile or key in the mobile number, which can be memorized easily, and make the payment. The payment app sends the payment request to UPI interface. UPI interface sends a request to payer bank, and once the money is deducted from the payer's bank account, UPI then sends the money to receiver bank. Receiver bank then sends a confirmation message to UPI about the money received. UPI then sends a confirmation message to payers and receivers payment app. Now imagine there is no cash money in India at all in the entire country. Anybody, any individual or any organization or any foreigner who visits India has to use UPI to even buy a slice of bread, and there is no other option. And imagine you do not have access to UPI for a month. You might manage food by taking help from your friends or relatives, but for how long? How will you manage things like your kids' school fees? Without UPI, you are as good as dead. Now, how SWIFT works? Remember, this is technically not exactly how SWIFT works, but more or less the same to understand today's topic. Because SWIFT system is not a payment system by itself like UPI, but it's a messaging platform, and it is the only option available currently for international money transfer between two countries. Now let's replace UPI with SWIFT payment system. Payer's payment application does not exist in this case, so it is directly the payer's bank. Same thing goes to the receiver. Receiver's payment application does not exist, so it is directly the receiver's bank. Also, UPI is mostly used by individuals, but SWIFT is used by banks directly on behalf of its customers, which can be an individual or an organization or a country itself. So I'll replace payer and receiver as a country just for explanation, because the individual or the organization ultimately is represented from which country they are originated from. Now Japan is the payer and Russia is the receiver. Imagine there is a sanctions imposed on Russia, so it is blocked in the SWIFT payment system. Nobody from Russia, be it an individual or organization, forget Russia as an entity itself, cannot buy anything from outside Russia or sell anything. No country can survive such a situation for long. This SWIFT system is misused by West so much, which is the foundation of all conflicts or wars since decades. Imagine US doesn't want India to grow economically or militarily, so they restrict India's growth using these sanctions to their will and wish. It's just an hypothetical example. Supply weapons to Pakistan and restrict India from buying S-400s from Russia. When US restricted India from buying S-400 air defense system, did they have any reason? Absolutely no. US sells 4th generation F-16 fighter jets to Pakistan, and when India wants to buy 5th generation fighter jets to have an upper hand, deny selling their 5th generation fighter jets and at the same time restrict India buying 5th generation fighter jets from Russia. If India disobeys West and go ahead with purchasing S-400 air defense system or 5th generation fighter jets from Russia, then impose sanctions on India. It is not an example. This is what happened in the past. The example I quoted about sanctions of Cuba was crazy, right? And the example I quoted about sanctions on India for S-400 air defense system purchase from Russia was crazier. Yes? These two examples are just nothing. Syria was sanctioned in 2011. Remember 2011. As per United States government website, the reason for sanctions on Syria was human rights violation by Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad. All the violations was before 2011, right? Because Syria was sanctioned in 2011. Now in 2011, West orchestrated a rebellion to overthrow Assad, and since 2011 at least 6 lakhs people were killed and 1.2 crore people, that is 12 million people, were displaced in Syria. Now tell me, who comes on top for human rights violation? Is it Assad before 2011 or the West after 2011? Human rights violation was just another script used by the West. Of course, there were human rights violation in Syria, but US didn't care about any violation. Biggest human rights violation was committed when US attacked 2 cities with nuclear weapons in Japan, killing civilians. In retaliation to Pearl Harbor, US had the right to attack Japan army bases, but in retaliation US wiped out 2 cities. Were there not kids in those cities? Were there not women in those cities? Human rights violation, my The actual reason for Syrian war was the oil and gas pipeline. There were 2 proposals of the pipeline. Of course, one which benefits US and the one which benefits Russia. At the center of both of these oil and gas pipeline proposal was Syria, crucial for both proposals. Bashar al-Assad, the Syrian dictator, became a ruthless dictator as soon as he supported the pipeline that benefits Russia. You take a conflict or a war. At the center of all these conflicts or war is this rich, spoiled brat called West, and US dollar's survival as an international currency and its digital weapon called SWIFT system. SWIFT payment system cannot be the only option for international payments. US dollar cannot be the only international currency. I hope people have a fair idea of what is sanctions and how sanctions are imposed using the only international payment system, SWIFT. Thank you.